for me, that was just like, whoa, what a whole totally different concept of, instead of like retiring early, why don't you take, say, 5 of those retirement years and intersperse them in your working years and springboard what you can do with your time off. And so that was like, I love that concept.
Have you ever wanted to take a career break or a sabbatical? Maybe you love the idea, but you didn't have the nerve or the know-how to make it happen. Well, today we dig in deeper with someone who's mastered the art of making this happen. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Dig Deeper with me, Digby Scott. My guest today is Katie Hare. Katie's an adventurer of both the world and the mind. If you check out her LinkedIn profile, it says she does contracting, consulting, and leadership, learning, and talent, which gives you a bit of an idea of the space she plays in, but it doesn't tell the full story. What makes her unique is that she straddles worlds. She's got a degree in marketing, yet has spent most of her career in HR. She's people-centric, yet with a data-driven approach. She's strategic, yet loves the detail. And she's someone who really knows her own mind, and she's super open to learning from others. She's such a multidisciplinarian. She also doesn't do anything by halves. There's this depth and deliberateness to everything she does, which blows me away. If she's in, she is in. And here's the thing, and here's where I want to start today. If you go even a little deeper into her LinkedIn profile and read between the lines, you'll notice something interesting. There's lots of gaps between the dates, gaps between jobs, like big gaps. What's that about? Katie Hare, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Digby. Thank you. What an intro.
Yeah, well.
It's always good to have somebody like read stuff cold and be like, oh, is that what you've taken from there? Oh, cool.
Yeah. This is the outside-in view of Katie Hare. And let's continue with that, because I'm really curious about the gaps. You know, it used to be a time when gaps on your CV were considered a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But I reckon you have a different view. Can you just tell us about the gaps and why they're there?
Yeah, isn't it interesting? And you'll even notice that a few years back, LinkedIn didn't even have the opportunity to be so loud and proud about those gaps. And now they have a tag, and it is, you know, career break, and it's got an image, an icon, and you're able to actually expand that out rather than just have a job and people read that there's a gap between one job to the next. So I think that's quite telling. Yeah. And so for me, even there was a gap in between high school and uni. And for being a Kiwi, your big OE is quite often after uni for a lot of people. But for me, I couldn't wait. And so that's one of my gaps, was straight there, overseas to the States and doing counselling and nannying, and at a camp, you know, all of that sort of stuff. And then back to uni, and then a few years later, it was like, right, got some work experience as well under my belt, and I need to get away. I got to go again. And so it was a year off before starting work over in the UK. And I was worried, I was quite deliberate about that. I was worried that if I went to the UK first and got a job, I might get stuck into it and not have the benefit of really exploring. So I was really deliberate about that. 8 years on, it was time to leave the UK, and we could go into that a bit later on, because that was probably the gap where I was in my late 30s and kind of being a lot more deliberate about taking that time off and what I wanted to do with it. And it was very experimental in development for me and really intentional. And then since then, more recently, I've had some time off as well. And again, that was different purpose, but also really intentional about creating a bit of a career shift for myself. So yeah, I've had several, and then also mini breaks. So all of those were quite long, and I've had some 3-month ones in between here and there. And I'm a big proponent for time off.
I love the way you say a mini break is 3 months, because I reckon for most people that would be whatever the opposite of a mini break is, a mega break.
Yeah.
So that's a mini one. I'm really curious about how most people, when they introduce themselves, would talk about kind of what they've done in the other parts of the CV, as in when it's work. And you've just provided an introduction, which is kind of who you are when you're not working, which I absolutely love. And I'm wondering about that first one. You said there was this after school. right? That was the first one that you did. And I get the sense there's a coiled spring sort of thing going on for you there.
It's burning.
Yeah. What do you reckon that was about?
That for me was, I've always had this sort of burning desire as a kid to travel and get overseas. And we were not, we didn't have enough money as a family. I wanted to do a student exchange even at school, and we just didn't have enough money to get me there. And so even before that, I remember I decided to join the Army Cadets at school, not because I liked to be in the Army Cadets, but because they had a trip to Australia at the end of the year. So I was real dogmatic about, I'll figure out a way to get myself overseas and get trips, And so it was probably the first one. And then after that, a couple of years before the end of high school, I was like, right, I'm going to get my part-time jobs. I'm going to figure out how I can earn money and live overseas. I'm going to use the family networks, and managed to get a couple of different nannying jobs from friends of the family, and also a summer camp job. And for me, that was just like the taste of going, yeah, this is me exploring the world, meeting new people, understanding what bigger and different is all about. And that got me excited for traveling from years to come. Yeah.
I want to dig under that. Like, where does that come from, right? So you hadn't traveled much as a younger kid.
Mm-mm.
There was this burning desire. What was there, like a formative experience? Was there a thing you saw on TV you thought,
yeah, I think there's a aspiration for something more. And then because we didn't have as much, and then I was exposed to quite a few people who had come from overseas. Like my grandparents were in Rotary and they were hosting events, and I would go around my little hors d'oeuvre trays chatting to people, helping out my grandparents with those sorts of things back in the 80s. And so deviled eggs and stuff like that, and I'll just be seeing and hearing all this chit chat, and I'm like, oh, that sounds amazing, that sounds so cool, and just hearing all these stories. And then the same thing, my dad and stepmom at the time, they would be the opposite end of the spectrum. They're sort of like hippies, and they'd be sort of like having people around the table, just coffee chats, but we're really loose people who are world travelers on the different end of the spectrum. And I'd be just like hearing all these stories going, I need that, that's what I want. So I think it was exposure to a variety of people who had done that. Yeah.
It sounds like an accumulation of experiences and people and hearing stories. And beneath all of those things, or threading them all together, was this, well, there's a bigger world than where I'm from, and I want to find out what that is about firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you reckon your thinking about breaks has evolved over time? Because you've done lots and you've listed a lot of them. And you mentioned, I want to pick up on that. You said, I think the one when I left London was the most deliberate.
Yeah.
So, and so that implies that before that you weren't so deliberate. It was a bit more, whatever the opposite of deliberate is, scattered or something.
Yeah.
How's it changed?
Yeah. So the first couple, the one after high school and the one to kind of almost get me over to London, they were like, travel, see the world, meet new people. Awesome. Put myself out of my comfort zone, great experiences. But the one that I had coming back from London was really deliberate in that it was like, how can you not just swan around and have drinks and go and see the world? How can you be more intentional about that to kind of for your own growth and development? And I'd come across a couple of things. One was a video by Stefan Sagmeister, Power of Time Off. It's a TED Talk, and that was quite inspirational for me in terms of what you can do to make the most of your time off. And he's this really cool creative designer, is quite world renowned, and
he sure is.
For me, that was just like, whoa, what a whole totally different concept of, instead of like retiring early, why don't you take, say, 5 of those retirement years and intersperse them in your working years and springboard what you can do with your time off. And so that was like, I was like, I love that concept. And the other one was Nicholas Petrie has done a couple of white papers around vertical leadership development. This is idea around how you can almost accelerate your own personal development and growth in your mindset. And he talks about creating the vertical development sweet spot, which was around creating some heat moments, so things to kind of really put yourself out of your comfort zone, giving yourself diverse perspectives, and surround yourself with people that can do some sense making. And so with those two in mind, I was like, well, what if I have a year off where I can create heat moments for myself, that I can give myself some new and different perspectives? And so I put out a message out on Facebook at the time. I said, right, in a few months, I'm going to have a year off and I want to do some volunteering. I want to connect with people. I want to travel to India. I want to do a retreat, a health retreat of some sort. I want to do this, do that, but I'm open to anywhere. And if you want someone to travel with, if you've got a couch for me to sleep on, if you've got an opportunity, let me know. And I had all these, I was really nervous putting it out because I'm not actually a big, public kind of put myself out there person all the time, but I put it out and I got all these amazing responses back from all of these people over the world, including people that I'd met in my time in America all those years ago, and people that I haven't spoken to in years, being genuinely excited for me and genuinely reaching out going, oh, you could do this. I'm traveling here. Let's do this for New Year's. And it just almost set my scene for that year off. And interspersed in that was traveling by myself through Southeast Asia, connecting with my family over the New Zealand holidays, and then going back overseas, things like that. And my experience of volunteering for 3 months in Myanmar was pretty unreal. So all of that was just really intentional, but what I got from that experience, I still was one of the best years of my life.
Yeah. And we'll get to this. I reckon more recently it's also been one of the highlight periods of your life too, in your last break. I want to come back to that later though. What struck me as you were talking about that decision is that you're not someone who seems to naturally want to follow a classic career ladder path.
Mm-mm.
So you're clear about that, right?
I am now. Possibly I wasn't, but I think it's always been anchored in these gaps, that it's almost like there's an element of me having some aspiration to kind of do more, add more value, but my thinking around that has shifted in terms of the previous model was to take a break and then accelerate your traditional career path again. And that was probably where I was at before leaving London. It was take a break, accelerate that career path because you can use it as a springboard. Do maybe work for an organisation that was more purposeful. That's where I was at the time. And I managed to do that when I came to Wellington to live. But yeah, I think it's continued to evolve since then.
What I'm hearing is the old model that you might have been running was work, and then reset or stop or something. It's kind of like get off the track, have a breather, recharge,
recharge, reset.
Yeah. And then back into it. Yeah. Whereas what I'm hearing now is more nuanced and more integrated. It's kind of like the breaks are actually an essential part that's not just about resetting, but it's also almost like it's reinventing. And there's a deliberateness to the unstructured part that's not work, but is still really, really critical to your life, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. I think I have had building blocks of reinventing within those prior years, but it's it's really accelerated now. And I think that whole model of what is the working life, has completely shifted over time, and the value that you place on and importance that you place on your traditional models of career versus designing your own life and what that can look like has really shifted for me.
Yeah, and I remember reading The 100-Year Life by Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott, right? And, that research that says anyone born in the Western world today, they've got a greater than 50% chance to living more than 100 years. So the old learn, earn, retire model, work 50 years.
So outdated already, yeah.
It's so outdated. And LinkedIn's gone with that, right? It's allowing different ways of describing your career. So it just makes complete sense to deliberately build in these breaks if we've got 100-year life to live.
Yep.
And you're sort of a bit of an exemplar or a model for doing that, right? And it's the word that you used when you're talking about Stefan Stegmaster's The Power of Time Off TED talk was you talked about it's deliberate and it's structured.
Mm-hmm.
Yet from the outside, and I know this from taking a sabbatical last year for 6 months, that from the outside it might be that's the last thing you want is a whole lot of deliberateness and structure, because isn't it just about getting away from that? What's your take on that, having deliberateness and structure with time off?
Yeah, I guess that's really a really interesting point. I think that really does come down to maybe a little bit of semantics about what you're talking about there when you talk about the level of structure and deliberateness. And so for the more recent one, where I sort of shifted from being in full-time permanent employment to into consulting, contracting, and now shaping what's more of a portfolio life sort of career, I think in order to do that, I'd sort of set myself up a year, and it only had sort of 4 words. I split it up into quarters. So intentional, as you like, with about I want to get into that phase of experimenting and testing what it's like to not be in permanent employment. And I just gave myself 4 quarters to do that, and named each one of those quarters and said, this is my intention for quarter 1. This is my intention for quarter 2, and so on. And you get any more prescriptive and deliberate, and I think you end up hamstringing yourself into areas that you lose opportunity, you lose the sort of the outcome of what it can be to just going with the flow and realizing what comes to you when you've got to give yourself more space. So it's a bit of a balance.
Yeah. I like it. So there's kind of flexibility within a framework, if you like.
Definitely.
Yeah. And the word intention rather than goal or something that you need to try and achieve is more, this is the other word that comes to mind is theme. Like there's a theme for this quarter, and that's about this. And I remember when you did that, and it was really inspiring to me because you kind of went first and I followed in terms of sabbaticals, and that it really helped me because with 6 months, it was like, man, that's a lot of time to not have structure. And at the same time, you can have a structure of something like, just the day-to-day life, running the house or whatever. But if that's all you're doing, then you're missing that reinvention opportunity and that exploration opportunity, right? So you seem to be someone who's like, nope, it's not about just being away from, it's actually moving towards something. I don't know what.
100%. Yeah. And I think that's really key. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a break if you need to get away from something, but ideally you do that well before you're ever in a position to needing that. And I think that's been really my focus. And there's something about using that time to reflect on who you have become and who you are becoming. And it's that becoming that, leaning towards, it's not just that external thing of what you're aiming for or what your next career pivot is going to be, but it's actually a lot to do with you in here.
Yeah, there's something that I reckon that must require some bravery, right? To be able to listen to that inner voice, to go, there's something about me here that I need to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think giving yourself the space enables you to do that. But some people will even say being brave is creating the space and holding it. And before you even get to that next bit, I think a few people were like, oh, you're so brave. You're taking this time off. You're so brave. And I was like, oh, really?
Yeah. It's interesting. It's often the decision. I remember years ago when I first went out on my own as a coach and I asked a bunch of people a whole lot of questions just to get some feedback about how I was perceived and positioned in the market and all that. And one of the questions I asked was, what do you think are my greatest accomplishments? And it wasn't really trying to get kind of an ego fix or anything like that, but it was more like, how do people perceive what I have done? And the most common response was your decision to go out on your own. And I'm like, well, that's not an accomplishment. That's just something that I've just started. But I think we often inspire people with it's the decisions to go against the grain and do what matters for us that inspires others to think, look at you go and do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd agree with that. And the funny thing is, like, so, even that word, your decision to, as opposed to things happening a little bit more organically and, using the word experiment. And that's been a big shift for me. And so if it's sort of, this feels like, when we do these things, people, the bravery is people in their own mindset when they're thinking about it going, you've walked off the cliff and you'll never get back once you've made that decision. And it's like, you can always shift that invariably. You can always go back to full-time employment. You can always have an alternative if you're a bit nervous about it. It's that experimental mindset that says this is just a phase and you're just trying it out, and you can go back if you want to, but what if you don't? What if you don't try it? That's where regret lies, I think.
Absolutely. The regrets of the dying, right? The things they regret not doing.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that my partner says, there are no wrong decisions. And that really helps me when I'm facing a scary moment. It's like, well, there are no wrong decisions. It's kind of like, what can you learn from it? Yes, there will be consequences, yet usually nothing's fatal. So go with it. I'm curious, Katie, about what are the barriers that you perhaps most had to overcome in any of those decisions to move away from maybe security or safety or whatever it might have been, the norm? Yeah. What are some of the demons that were there for you?
Yeah, I think there is always a little bit, if you are going a little bit against the grain or the norm, or is it hard because not enough people are doing it, and and then because not enough people are doing it, their fears can start seeping into you a little bit. Money is always one. If you're making this shift, including whether it's taking time off, and you got a mortgage and bills to pay, or if you're going out on your own. That is definitely always one. It's a very real one, but I think it gets overplayed, if I'm honest. Yeah.
Tell us why. Why is that?
I just think in this world, when you're thinking about let's think about the Wellington market at the moment. Everybody's being laid off and made redundant. They're all in permanent, safe work, and so there's this thing where you could have that done to you. And wouldn't it be better if you could do that to yourself, with all of the upsides of redundancy with none of the downsides? And so I've sort of experimented with that process a little bit.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago called We're All Fixed Term. And it was just challenging the idea, or lots of ideas that, we're around forever, which we're not, that jobs are permanent, which they're not, and all of the language around that. And I think sometimes we have these kind of languages and frames that are just limit us. And I'm interested in that. Yeah. When there's not many other people doing it. Yeah. And so it's hard. What was it as you got into kind of like mortgage land and responsibility land and all that sort of stuff? What was it that propelled you, particularly for this last career break? Because, you'd gone around the planet a few times, around the sun a few times. You've gathered experience and expertise and, you had a good job. What was it that kind of propelled you forward for this most recent one? Because on your LinkedIn profile, it says it's the best one yet. And I love the way you started that comment. You said, time is true currency. And I reckon maybe that's part of the answer to the question. Yeah. But what was it that you went, no, I've got to do this?
Yeah. I think having learnt from all of my prior experiences, this thing that I've kind of coined as sort of like, the career break afterburn, so to speak. And there's these, we get so focused on career, we forget about what a well-lived life is and all of the things that you can do when you're not having the break, and then the benefits that come after that. And from all of the data that I've had from my very real experiences, if anything, you can earn more money by having the break. and the benefits of revisiting, your values, your this, your that, all of these things, and then becoming someone new, a bit different, a new evolution, a better version of yourself after it. If you don't have that space, if you just go from one job to the next without really giving yourself that time to almost strategically think about what you want next in life and vision, there's some major gaps there. And all we think about is money so often that drives us with these decisions, far too much weight on it, as opposed to all of the intangible benefits that you'll get from this. And there's so many. And I just think that it's sad that we don't think about those as some real benefits. Well, we do when we start getting into the 50s and 60s, but I'm like, do it earlier, guys.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Totally right. It's funny because, well, there's a few directions we could go here. One is the money thing, because I'm conscious of, you and I come from what most people would say is a relatively privileged upbringing, background. Not everyone's going to have the same opportunities that we might have been afforded. And so, where we kind of go, money's a thing, it's all relative in some ways, right? What do you say to that? Like, and maybe this is a societal challenge as opposed to, the individual focus, but what comes up as I talk about that?
It is, and again, like this is, our own context is really important here. And I think it's about if you sort of lift up into having the level of break in some way and understanding the benefit of what space and time off can bring and giving that to you and whatever your context is and how you can afford it. But I mean, I've gone through, prior times earlier of having almost $0 to my name and still trying to get some of that time off, those goals achieved. So yeah, I think, but it is something that's very real for people. And I just think there's an element of ways that you can do that to still figure out with your budget what you can afford and what options. There are multiple options available to give you that space, but it is about your context. Like, for example, I don't have kids, my partner does, but they don't live with us permanently. Yeah. So that creates some space and some gap that other people don't have. They'll have young kids, and that will be that's different for them, So there's all these things that you got to break into it to make sure it's unique to you.
Well, yeah, for someone who maybe can't do a year off, right? But they might be able to do a month. How would you, from your experience, how would you suggest someone uses a month?
Yeah, I think there's a big thing there. Prior to all of this, it is about thinking about the type of life that you want to lead. Right. Yeah. And if you're not even sure of that yet, maybe that's some of the stuff that you've been thinking about doing in your time off. I read there was this interesting article, I think it was Harvard, it'll come to me, but it was about strategizing, for your life. And
how will you measure your life?
For your life?
It's Clay Christensen.
Strategize in the word in this one. And it was saying something like the people that had interviewed, only 21% of them had thought about what a well-lived life means to them. And I was like, what? And that was from those that interviewed. So that's probably quite a segment of population that, Harvard are connecting themselves to. And I was just like, it makes me quite sad actually, that that percentage is not just so low in comparison to what you can get if you do decide to be a bit more deliberate about it.
You're one of the most deliberate people I know. And I'm wondering, is there a time, recently or otherwise, where, the question, how do I want to use my life? What's my life about? Was so far out of reach. It was fuzzy. Because I know personally for me, there was a time, might have been in my early 30s. It was around the time I just started to have kids. And I think that stark reality of, holy crap, there is this whole next 2 decades at least of, being a hands-on dad. What's my life about beyond that going to be? And I couldn't answer the question. And I remember where I was standing, and it was terrifying. It was the terrifying bit is that I couldn't access an answer that made any sense to me.
Right.
And yeah, it was like, oh my God, is this it? And
so this
and I'm
is
wondering
in your
for you,
period of young family feeling like
the
what
walls
was,
are closing
what was going
in.
on? Oh, the walls are closing in. So you're
There
sort of
was-
like, decisions are made for me. Here's my life path mapped out.
That's it.
Tell me
And
more about that.
Yeah. Well, you want me to tell you more?
Yeah.
I think it was just that. It was, how did I get here? And then where am I going? And it was those questions just, well, the how did I get here was kind of irrelevant, but the where am I going was a void. There was nothing. And I think it was probably, for me, it was that I think I had been cruising. I'd come out of a period of a massive burnout, professional burnout. And I think I just let go of aspiration. I'd let go of striving. And I don't think I'd used that muscle for quite a while. And so to vision the future is something I hadn't really thought about. I kind of thought about how do I want to be living day to day. And I was pretty clear on that, but it was more the directional challenge, right?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So I've been doing quite a bit of coaching here and there, and experimenting with a template that's actually it's sort of called the Career Odyssey Plan, and I've been using that part of that sort of as a tool for coaching. And what I find really interesting is that so often in that, it's the idea is to kind of map out a few different career scenarios, and then you sort of lock a little bit more onto one and map out a little bit more over the next 5-10 years what that might shape to be. And people that kick it off, they find it really hard to get to what is the constraints, what are the things that are, and I use those words constraints because that's their mindset of these are the things that I have going on in my life right now. That means I can't achieve what I think I might do. I can't even open up my mind. Yeah, there's limiting beliefs. And it's all around sort of that it's kind of like, well, you know, I've got kids this age, I've got these financial responsibilities, I've got this, and it's like, oh, but maybe in 5 or 10 years you won't have those. So how might you shape something a bit differently to thinking about that? Your kids will be older, you might not have that same level of financial response, all of these things. And it's like, oh yeah. And I just think, you know, push it out a decade and your whole world's in landscape
take the long
shifted.
view.
But too often we're living in this context now. Yeah.
I want to come back to the question that you beautifully seem to avoid. Maybe you didn't have an answer to it, which was, what about a time in your life which was a bit the same? It was like, I don't know where to go from here. What was happening if there was a time like that?
I think there's been a couple of those. Probably one was when I was going to London. I was sort of in a relationship, but I'd say that I knew wasn't right for me and I needed to go. And I was working and I was earning good money and learning a lot, but it was like, actually, my dream was to be overseas, not still sitting here in Dunedin. And there was probably one. And the other one was once I was in London and I was working in financial services, and I'm just sitting here going, oh, my visa's tied to this job, but I'm not enamored with the culture and the lifestyle of, you know, financial services, and that environment is not me. Yeah.
I am not my visa.
Yeah.
And what was that like for you, realizing that?
Yeah. And I think both of those ones is that you do feel, you know, like it feels constraining. But I think also there's a burning flame, and there's a burning flame, and there's a voice that's saying, this doesn't feel right. It's not comfortable. And the more you listen to that, it's not easy to listen to because usually you got something tied into those things. Yep. But the more and faster you listen to that, it gives you sort of that conviction to try and break free or break out of it and do something a bit drastic. And when you do it, your level of freedom and, you know, that comes from that is unreal.
That's, you know, this idea that I often hear people say, I want more confidence so I can make the break or jump and do the thing I really want to do. And I said, no, you don't. You need more courage.
Yeah.
And you don't need confidence, you need courage. And where does courage come from? You've talked about it. It's the burning flame. It's the conviction. Conviction leads to courage, leads to confidence. And I think knowing in yourself that that's the most important thing beyond some visa that keeps you in a job in the financial sector in London. It's like, there is a better life I want for me here. And that's the conviction, right?
And you'll have to make trade-offs. So typically it's not difficult for no reason. There usually is a trade-off that has to be made as part of that burning flame that comes with it.
Yeah.
And so the London example was I had to leave a pretty awesome London lifestyle and that I've forged over 8 years with some really good friends. And, I had to go, that will be a trade-off on Europe's doorstep, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But it was a difficult decision for 2 weeks, but then it opened up doors of possibilities elsewhere. Yeah,
and I often think of that, and I found it really hard making transitions where, so for example, coming from Western Australia to live in Wellington 17 years ago, I love Western Australia. I still love Western Australia. And I resisted leaving because I was, I think, focused on the tangible things that were there, like the weather and the beaches and the networks of people I had. But then if I went back to less of the detail and more of the what are they actually about, as in, it's being in the ocean, it's being able to have adventures, it's being around good, interesting people that I can learn with and from. Then I went, well, could I get that in Wellington? Yeah, I could get that in Wellington. And because I could answer yes to that, it really helped me it made the transition not easy, but easier. Because I was like, the things I've got in my old world, I could get in my new world. And that makes a big difference. Hey, I want to ask you a question. What's lighting you up? What's lighting your brain up right now? What are you thinking about? Because you're such a well-versed person in, pioneering into this sabbatical career break space.
Yeah.
If you think about now, you think about where you're taking things, what's going on in your mind?
I'm deliberately uncomfortable at the moment.
Tell us about it. Why?
And I am doing a fair amount of experimenting with this portfolio career. And so for me, we talked about this career odyssey plan. Well, part of my plan a few years out, an idea that I think might be a nice one, and I've seen a role model that does this for me, and was, having 6 months of the year, every year off. I'm like, ooh, what would that even look like?
Right.
And I've actually had that this year. Not quite a full 6 months off. It's been, if you add it all up, I haven't been working for 6 months of the full year. And and the timing wise, it's kind of exciting because one of my words of this year is generate, and I want to generate my own work, my own IP, my own. A lot of it's around coaching, a lot of it's very OD developmental workshops, etc. And so I've kind of left myself in this space, which feels uncomfortable because I'm not earning as much maybe as I might be had I been working all of these hours, but in the same space, it's leaving me with time to generate. And it's like, oh, how much time do I want? Do I want the full sort of idea of 6 months to do this? I'm playing with this idea of I've almost got the luxury of too much time versus too little time. And it's deliberately uncomfortable. It's a bit like, ugh.
What makes that challenge uncomfortable, do you reckon?
That I'm not traveling overseas or doing all these things. I'm like at home with time off, which is, it's a little bit different from what it has been in the past.
Yep.
And it's probably a bit too much. I think there's an element where you need a level of stress, and I've had probably the least few less working years of my life, which has been really awesome. But I also realized there's a point where you need to create good stress.
Yeah, stress.
me stress. And so there's an element of, all right, how do I create that when there's no external forces imposing the stress on me? I need to generate that for myself. And so, that's interesting.
It's kind of like that with great freedom comes great responsibility. You've got freedom of time.
Yeah.
Yet there's the responsibility to use it well. Mm-hmm. And that sounds like that's the uncomfortable question right now. And the other thing that comes up for me with that is that, it's a bit like, do we have to wait for a burnout or a heart attack or some other catastrophe to force us to make a significant shift in direction? And for most, if you look around, I reckon most of the time the answer would be yes. And I'm noticing you nodding, shaking your head going, no. There's something about how, the vertical development thing. How do you bring the heat, right? If I'm staying at home and I'm not traveling because heat is a different culture, what does heat look like now, right? Yeah. What are the options for you for that? Bringing heat, given that you're staying in Wellington or you're not going far.
Yeah.
What could that be?
Yeah, well, or working remotely, but basically the desire is to work as opposed to do something else with that time, like learning or research. It is genuinely generate and work to generate value. So, there's a couple of things I have been doing, and I sort of need to give myself credit for a little bit of that as well. So, but it's just weird in the space of being relaxed, right? So, so like I delivered a whole new workshop, generated some new IP, and it just 5 years ago, if you asked me to do that, I would have been stressing out, and I just did it, and it was nice, and I was just like, oh, that went successful, and I think so that's great, that to acknowledge that in that I was able to be creative and generate something that was quite valuable without feeling that pressured to do it. But I do think that there's some committing to dates was part of that. Like, I can have that done by this date. Selling it before it's ready. There's a few things that I think are helpful. Those sort of forcing functions to make you get shit done. Otherwise, how long is you can stretch it out. You can stretch your time out if you want. Absolutely. And we do the same in the workplace, it's no different.
Some sort of external accountability
absolutely
is important. The other word that keeps coming out, we've both been talking about, is when we say time off, the word off. I wonder whether that's just a bit of a red herring, because it comes back to that old pattern you talked about, which is go, have a rest. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether there's a different word or a different phrase than time off that might actually help us think about these whole idea of career breaks completely differently.
Yeah, I don't know, because even the idea of career break versus, just a break, because is it a break from your career? Is it all about your career? Or is it about everything else as well? Yeah, I've been exploring that thinking. And it's not off. It's just sort of that, it's that, for me, that's that well-balanced life that's sort of working for you. And again, the word balance, well, there's no balance of this or that. There's like integration and dialing things up and down depending 100%. On where you're at and what your context is.
Let's banish the binary, right? On, off, it's about the career or not, work/life balance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All of those things, right? It's
sound bites don't like nuances though, Digby.
Damn, good thing I'm not in the soundbite business then. Can we just zoom out for a moment, right? So we've been talking about you and your journey and how you think about this stuff. Yeah. If we think about the implications in the 100-year life, right? And what that means, not just for individuals and how we design our lives, but how do we design work differently? How do we design society differently? I know you and I are both interested in those questions. And I'm wondering about, where are you pushing into that space, or where are you maybe even seeing there's interesting things happening at that level? What are you noticing?
Well, I'm noticing a lot more around through, different generations of workforce, that it's sort of seems more natural for people when you think about influencing people, creating, videos from, in high school in their spare time, those sorts of things. I mean, we think about this idea of work and generating income starting, after high school, when nowadays a lot of that is actually happening during high school. So it's expanding, I think, this idea of working for yourself, what income can look like. I think that we need to be thinking about that a little bit more, and the type of lifestyle that people want and see that can support that, because you've got a lot of generations sort of looking at how they can think about income completely differently from what it's been, either what they're seeing their parents do, because they're not looking to their parents anymore, they're looking to TikTok, and so it's like, well, then from an employer's perspective, if you're still thinking about having an organization of people and ideas, then what does that look like to support those? And I think the stuff that still rings true is giving people autonomy, giving people flexibility. It's why people want to do a portfolio life or work for themselves. And they're just still missing that point when it comes to supporting an organization of people. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you, are you seeing any organizations around the world or here locally that are trying a few different things in that regard? Very closed-ended question, by the way, isn't it?
Yeah, I know.
Yes or no? You can say no.
Yeah, I'll have a think. Have you?
Well, I mean, there's the classic, 4-day work week stuff, which is allowing, traditional notion of work to be, not even compressed, but it's just like we just get productivity done in less hours because we're just doing it smarter, right? So, I mean, that's the classic one that I think is out there. I think there's a lot of questions being asked right now. I think there's an awareness that wasn't there pre-COVID, and COVID has cracked the nut, and I don't know where I go with that metaphor, but there's something about that nut's not going back together. As much as old policies and old thinking is trying to put it back together, I think I reckon the ground is ripe. Fertile, it's a better word. Ground isn't ripe, but fertile for now's the time to innovate and experiment, right? At scale around, you alluded to it, why we come together as people is to create value in some way. And there's generally an income or a financial aspect to that, right? And so let's come back to that core question. Why do we come together? For that reason, what are the different ways in which we can come together that work for everyone? I reckon that's kind of one of the core questions, eh? And I think what you're doing is at a personal level, you're modeling, well, here's another way to show up in the world. I'm adding value. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still interesting that we haven't come up with the name of an organisation that's doing that. So there's a lot of experimenting going on, isn't there? And I'm just not seeing that happen from an organisational perspective, which is no wonder that you are getting this difference between more people figuring out, I'll go out it on my own, or I'll have an organisation that will support me, to almost acting as a hub to support those people to go out on their own a little bit more. I mean, you even need to look at the Henry app and see that exploding for people that are, self-employed sole practitioners.
Yep.
And it's making it completely easy for individuals to go out on their own because they've thought of an app that just streamlines the challenge of GST and tax for everybody. And that's exploding. There's little things like that you go, any platform or any organisation that can support that model better. I think there's lots of opportunity in that, because I'm seeing more appetite for supporting that model as opposed to thinking about how we can do this better in an organisation. Because people
it's almost like, don't try and retrofit an organisation, just create a new model from the ground up, right?
A little bit.
And it reminds me of Dan Pink. He wrote a book, I think it was his first ever book, called Free Agent Nation, where he noticed years and years ago, like 20 odd years ago, that there was this whole uncounted workforce in the US, and they were the free agents who were doing their own thing in their own way. They weren't working for organisation, but they weren't counted in a lot of the stats. And maybe we don't think about organizations. Maybe we just need to go beyond that idea to go, well, where is the value being transferred and created in society? Yeah. And I think you're right. There's a rising number of people who want to do it differently.
Yeah.
Interesting. I have one last question, which is, what have you learned through this conversation, Katie Hare?
Thanks, Sophie. I've learnt, I know that I hate being put on the spot with these sorts of questions.
No, we already knew that.
I think would be just really interested to see if this is sort of knocking on the door of things that people are interested in learning a little bit more about. Even prior to having this conversation, this, for me, this feels, it feels kind of just a normal way of being now. And when I have that through the conversation with you, you hear it's sort of like, oh yeah, rolling off the tongue, like, yeah, I've managed to do this a few times. You sort of learn that, but I don't think that's for everybody. So I just need to keep reminding myself of that there's still, it's quite scary for people. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hearing you've learned that you've got this, actually, and maybe through this conversation, there's a realization that, oh yeah, I'm kind of just doing it now.
Yeah. But saying that, if you hear, I'm reflecting back on that last element of conversation, and there's still that level of uncomfortableness around what that new period for me is. So yeah, I do like to be in the uncomfortable.
Yeah, you do. I reckon that's a great place to finish up. Thanks, Katie. I've learned that you're someone who, have I learned this? I don't know if I learned this. I think I'm reminded that deliberateness and structure don't have to be the enemy of flexibility. And to me, that's an incredibly powerful thing for someone like me who loves freedom and flexibility. Deliberateness and structure can enable that. So thank you for reminding me of that.
Thank you for summarising that. Yeah.
That's what nice. I do. Hey, if people wanted to find out more about you, where would they go?
They can go to that LinkedIn that's got all the gaps in it.
I think they've already been checking it out as we've been talking. Awesome, Katie. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Digby.
See ya. This conversation with Katie, folks, has really got me thinking, and wonder if it's got you thinking about the idea of flexibility within a framework. And what I'm inspired by with Katie is the way in which she can see the framework that she's operating in, or at least attempts to see it, and then she creates flexibility if it's not working for her. That story about London and the visa and working in the financial sector, and she's going, well, this framework's not really serving me. And so she'll challenge the framework, or she'll at least see it, and then she'll go, I need to create a new one. And to do that, she creates the space to be flexible with ideas, and she experiments, she tries new things, and despite being scared. And, that to me, it's got me thinking, where am I limiting myself with my own frameworks about what's possible and what's not? And what if I could challenge some of those ideas about what I could do or what I couldn't do, and then maybe just experiment with a few? And I think, this is, I think, the essence of being a pioneering spirit. I'm wondering what it's got you thinking more deeply about, and I'm wondering what you might do. What's one small thing that you could try out as a result of listening to this conversation? I'd love it if you could share this episode with one other person, perhaps like it in the podcast app that you listen to. I'd love it if you could subscribe, because then you just get more of the good stuff coming through. And I hope that you found this food for thought, going deeper with Katie Hare and me, Digby Scott. I'll see you next time.